This week marks the 35th anniversary of one of the most infamous episodes in modern Indian history, the day the Republic and its institutions turned their collective back on an entire section of the people, abandoning them to genocidal mobs for 4 days of mass killing, rape, arson and loot. The massacre of around 5,000 Sikhs in the nights and days that followed Indira Gandhi's assassination on October 31st, 1984, was not just a tragedy for the Sikhs, but an event that holds lessons for the rest of us as well. Many of you watching this video are too young to know or even imagine what happened in India's capital city. Those were the days before the internet and even independent news television, so there is not much by way of a contemporary audio-visual archive. Even the newspapers of the day did not convey the enormity of the horror, and it was left to human rights organizations like People's Union for Civil Liberties, People's Union for Democratic Rights, and Citizens for Democracy, organizations that are today seen as not just unnecessary but also anti-national, to document what happened and, more importantly, how it happened and who were the guilty. I would urge you to browse through the November 1984 massacre archives at The Wire to read and understand what happened, because this is not just a question of history. In today's episode of Beyond the Headlines, I will explain why the massacre remains a malignancy on the body politic of India, a cancerous lesion that touches and affects and sickens us all, and whose symptoms have appeared in other parts of the country, from Malyana and Hashimpura in 1987 to Bhagalpur in 1989, Bombay in 1993, and Gujarat in 2002. How might clinical diagnosticians describe the pathology of November 1984 as the massacre of the Sikhs has come to be remembered? They would identify 6 key features. First, the mobs which assembled in New Delhi, Kanpur, Bokaro and other North Indian cities had the political blessing and backing of the ruling party at the time, the Congress. Since there was never a formal criminal investigation into this aspect, we cannot say for certain how the conspiracy was hatched and executed. Of course, the involvement of senior Congress ministers and leaders like H.K.L. Bhagat and Sajjan Kumar had been credibly alleged within days of the massacre. After a great struggle by the survivors of the killings, Sajjan Kumar, who was a mid-level Congress functionary in 1984, finally got convicted only last December. The Delhi High Court bench of Justices S. Muralidhar and Vinod Goyal overturned the trial court verdict which had acquitted him, and their judgment is perhaps the first time a court has acknowledged the role that political sponsorship has played in a mass crime of this sort. A majority of the perpetrators of these horrific mass crimes enjoyed political patronage and were aided by an indifferent law enforcement agency, the court said. The criminals escaped prosecution and punishment for over 2 decades. It took as many as 10 committees and commissions for the investigation into the role of some of them to be entrusted in 2005 to the Central Bureau of Investigation, 21 years after the occurrence. While Sajjan Kumar is now rotting in prison, none of the really big fish on the political or administrative side were ever investigated. However, the moral, political, and even legal culpability of the highest levels, including Rajiv Gandhi, who was Prime Minister at the time, may easily be inferred from their behavior during and after the violence. The fact that Rajiv Gandhi did not want the massacre probed or investigated and was happy to let the guilty walk tells us that the monstrous crime which happened must have had his approval. The judicial commission he set up under Ranganath Mishra was a farce. Subsequent commissions and committees established to probe various aspects of November 1984, such as the complicity of the police, were either ineffective or had their recommendations brazenly cast aside. Many of the politicians named by survivors and independent citizens' inquiries all prospered in Rajiv Gandhi's time and later. The second feature that stands out when we speak of November 1984 is that while minorities had always been disproportionately affected by communal violence in post-independence India, unlike the riots of earlier decades, this time there was no face-off between mobs. The November 1984 killings were not the result of a clash between Hindus and Sikhs, but the product of targeted one-sided attacks on Sikhs by mobs that could not even summon the fig leaf of a prior or imminent attack on Hindus as a justification. Third, the mobs operated with a certain amount of planning and precision. They appeared to have voter lists so as to identify individual Sikh homes. They had transport and fuel and arms, all of which was openly on display. They moved around at the direction of Congress leaders, and many eyewitnesses and survivors have confirmed this repeatedly. Fourth, the killings took place with the backing of the police, which let the mobs go about their business with impunity and refused to offer any protection to the victims. In some places, they actively prevented Sikhs from defending themselves. Once the violence ended, police complicity took on a different dimension. Across the city, they refused to accept complaints or register first information reports. When cases were sometimes opened, the police wrote them up and investigated them in a slipshod manner so that it would be impossible for a court to convict the accused. Fifth, the victims were left to look after themselves in relief camps set up by co-religionists and members of civil society, with the state administration refusing to provide any assistance. Sixth, there was no shortage of God-fearing decent folk, people like us, who willfully ignored the crimes which were committed all around, and who found ways to rationalize and justify the violence, and who refused to acknowledge that the leader in whom they reposed so much faith was tainted in any way by his moral and political responsibility for what had happened. It does not take much imagination to recognize several or all of these symptoms in the communal killings that have followed since, especially Gujarat in 2002. As Santayana said, those who cannot learn from history are condemned to repeat it. All you have to do is substitute BJP for Congress, Maya Kodnani for Sajjan Kumar, Narendra Modi for Rajiv Gandhi, and the action-reaction theory of our current Prime Minister with the big tree whose falling the late Congress Prime Minister invoked as an alibi for his own moral culpability. In Gujarat too, the police sabotaged the investigation of cases. Just to be on the safe side, the Modi government appointed weak or biased prosecutors to ensure there were no convictions. True, the higher judiciary, which remained singularly unmoved by the gross violation of minority rights that November 1984 came to signify, has since been more mindful of its constitutional duties. If the victims of the 2002 massacre have had some modicum of justice, this is because the National Human Rights Commission, which was headed at the time by Justice J.S. Verma and had stalwart members like Virendra Dayal, actively intervened, and the Supreme Court ensured that some of the cases were either transferred out of Gujarat or probed by a special investigation team outside the control of the state government. It helped that the media too, which chose not to stay with the 1984 story, has over the years learned some lessons of its own. Despite their greater vigilance, however, the media seems unable or unwilling to connect the dots and insist on basic legal reform that would end the political abuse of state power that lies at the heart of the worst massacres. Unlike the BJP politicians who talk of 1984 only to attack the Congress but are silent about 2002, Justice Muralidhar of the Delhi High Court reminds us that these killings are symptomatic of the same underlying problem. The November 1984 massacres, he wrote in his Sajjan Kumar judgment, was neither the first instance of a mass crime nor, tragically, the last. There has been a familiar pattern of mass killings in Mumbai in 1993, in Gujarat in 2002, in Kandhamal, Odisha in 2008, in Muzaffarnagar in UP in 2013, to name a few, he wrote. Common to these mass crimes were the targeting of minorities and the attacks spearheaded by the dominant political actors being facilitated by the law enforcement agencies. The criminals responsible for the mass crimes have enjoyed political patronage and managed to evade prosecution and punishment. Bringing such criminals to justice poses a serious challenge to our legal system. As these appeals themselves demonstrate, decades pass by before they can be made answerable. This calls for strengthening the legal system. Neither crimes against humanity nor genocide is part of our domestic law of crime. This loophole, he said, needs to be addressed urgently. Clearly, what India needs is reform that will make ministers and police officers legally liable for mass crimes like the communal killings of 1984 and 2002, or for example, the ethnic cleansing of Pandits from Kashmir, which they failed to prevent despite being in a position to do so. Since criminal investigations are in the hands of the executive, we may never get the evidence we need to prove that a prime minister or a chief minister or a police officer actively conspired to kill innocent citizens. But there is, in international law, the concept of command responsibility, under which the failure to act in the face of genocide or crimes against humanity makes an individual in authority legally culpable for the violence. This is the direction we need to go in India. The day politicians and police officers who stand by as innocent people are killed, and you know who you are, get prosecuted and sent to jail, will be the day India can begin finally to exorcise the ghosts of November 1984.